Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Okay, I wanted to thank you, Dennis, and I wanted to thank Eve. I really enjoyed her presentation, and some of the things that she said are the kinds of things I would usually say too. In fact, Ev was talking about our basic psychological needs and how they may not be satisfied during the pandemic, and that's exactly one of the things I highlight. And I also wanted to say that I'm excited to speak to your group because my daughter is a member of your community, and I've marveled over the last 3 years how how excellent your community is at making young people feel autonomous, connected, and competent. And I think you really do something right in the way you introduce children and young people to the community. So I'm going to be talking about maintaining our well-being during a once-in-a-century pandemic. I've been talking to various groups through McGill University and other places. Sometimes I call it enhancing well-being, but I think that might be aiming a little too high, and we should be compassionate with ourselves, like Av mentioned, and just getting back to our usual level of well-being would probably be a good accomplishment. Okay, so what I'll be doing in my 25 minutes or so is to talk about how psychology has historically thought about what well-being means. And then I'll share the perspectives of two experts on disasters and on social isolation. One of the experts is an American science writer. The other expert is a Quebec astronaut. So the first thing I want to tell you is that there's actually two distinct types of well-being that have been studied going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So philosophers and now psychologists think about well-being in two very different ways. The most common way, and this is probably how you've always thought about well-being, is in terms of the hedonic valence of your emotions. We sometimes refer to this as happiness, and what it basically means is the balance of positive to negative experiences. And it's very natural for human beings to want to have a greater frequency and amount of positive emotions like joy and pride and friendship than negative emotions like stress and anxiety and sadness. So historically, that's what most of us have focused on. Unfortunately, this hedonic form of well-being is very vulnerable to things that happen in our lives. If we lose our job, if we lose our partner, if something unfortunate happens, the balance of positive to negative emotions changes. And one thing I can tell you for sure is that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been living through now for 4 months, has taken a hit on our hedonic well-being. So for almost all of us, we're experiencing less positive emotions and more negative emotions than we would typically. However, there is a second type of well-being that's not so affected by the slings and arrows of fortune. And this is called eudaimonic well-being. And it goes all the way back to Aristotle, who argued that hedonic well-being should not be our focus. Eudaimonic well-being translates from the Greek as the good spirit or the true spirit. And it involves being true to yourself and what you're capable of and fulfilling yourself. And modern psychologists measure this mostly in terms of whether our life feels like it has meaning and purpose. Now, what I would say is that even though our hedonic well-being or our usual level of happiness may be lower, there's a good chance that we could still find meaning and purpose. And that's what I'm going to try to focus on. Okay. Now, I just want to say, why would our hedonic well-being be lower? Why would we have less positive emotions, more negative emotions? Here are some of the things that have happened to all of us. There's been some big events that you were looking forward to that aren't happening. So I have both a niece and a nephew who are supposed to get married this summer, and that was called off. And I went to one of these marriages a couple of years ago, and it was a wonderful family reunion. But that's a loss. And all of us have losses like that. A second thing, all of us have personal goals, things we're trying to achieve, things that we're looking forward to in the future. You may have wanted to go on a trip. You may have wanted to do a triathlon. That's been canceled too. So our goals have been interrupted. Another thing that's happened to some of us is that some of our relationships, for all intents and purposes, have been severed. Now, that's not the case with your closest friends and with your family, but I bet you there's a lot of people who you would see who are acquaintances and who you had nice relationships with, but you don't see them anymore. So I used to go to YMCA and NDG. There were at least 5 to 10 people who I had friendly connections with, and I haven't seen any of them. And I don't have their phone numbers. I don't know how to get in touch. But so there's some relationships that aren't there anymore for us. And the last thing, and I've just added this to my talk, there's a sociologist who says that all of us need a third place. We have our home and we have our work. Hopefully we still have our work, but we need another place, kind of a friendly, safe place that's neither work or family, but that feels like a home. For me, the YMCA has turned into that. For other people, it could be their church. And I'm guessing from what I've seen of your church, for many people, your church is the third place where they feel accepted, they see friendly faces, they get some support. And what's unfortunate is that we don't have that right now. In fact, some of us don't even have a second place because we're with our family while we're working at home and the kids are at home and we never get away. And all of that definitely would lead to more anxiety. But I think the other thing is our needs aren't being satisfied like they ordinarily would. You and I get something special by going to that third place. And we feel more competent, we feel more connected, and we're leading a much more limited existence. Now, so here's an example of how we would measure the hedonic well-being. We would ask you in the last 2 weeks, how often have you felt joyful? How often have you felt unhappy? And what I could guarantee you is that almost all of us, if you compared the way you would rate this in January and February versus the way you rated it in March and April, you'd see that the negative emotions were more prominent and the positive emotions were weaker. So we've been affected. The good news, though, is with hedonic well-being, it's something that fluctuates, but it almost always will return to your personal baseline in about 6 months. And this is true even if the pandemic continues with all the uncertainty. You are going to readapt and you'll have the same baseline level of positive versus negative affect. Okay. The first expert I'll tell you about is an American science writer. She wrote for Time magazine, and she was an investigative reporter and a science reporter who was involved with all of the big catastrophes and unthinkable events that happened in the 1990s and the 2000s. So she studied hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, terrorist attacks, and she carefully put together a stage theory of how we cope and adapt. And that was really very well done. I heard an interview with her, and she was asked about the pandemic. And the interviewer thought, "You've never seen anything like this, have you?" And she said, "No, No, this is actually kind of similar to what happened at Hurricane Katrina, which was the hurricane that hit New Orleans, and then the dams burst and the city basically flooded, and people had to go on their rooftops. And what she says is most disasters are fast and sudden, but the pandemic and Hurricane Katrina are gradual and slow moving, but that many of the same stages that you would have to deal with in any disaster will occur for us. Now, she was asked, how do you think Americans are handling the pandemic? And she said something that I think we all have to remember, which is that people are experiencing very different pandemics depending on many different things in your lives. So your experience of this pandemic is different from mine, and mine is different from another person. And we know why it might differ. So, for example, demographic things like what is your race, what is your income, what is your age? There's very clear evidence that people who are Black or who are Latino are experiencing much higher infection rates, are dying at higher rates, and that they're getting less access to good health care. Lower income people are experiencing this pandemic more difficultly, and age is impacting people so that the health risks are greater the older you are. Interestingly, though, so far the early studies that suggest the psychological effects are strongest and most negative on young adults between the ages of 18 and 30. And at first that puzzled me because they're not at such great risk of having a very bad health outcome if they catch COVID. But I think the thing is, when you're 18 to 30, that's a critical time of your life where you want to figure out what you want to do, who you want to be with, what you want to believe in. And you really want to get out there and make things happen and be involved. And unfortunately, last March, time stopped. People who were pursuing a degree were told, you got to leave campus, you got to get back home. So a lot of young people are living in their parents' basements and they're having very limited existences. And it's very contrary to what they were hoping for and expecting. Some other things that are important are your health status. So if you have asthma or diabetes, this pandemic is so much more frightening. If you have children who are at home and you're trying to do your work, but also help them with their online schooling, that's very difficult. My former students who are now professors, almost all of them are working at home. Most of them are women. And they all say that the most difficult thing is that they feel so guilty about the way they're parenting because they find that they just can't do their work and also take care of the house and also teach their kids. So what they're doing is they're actually letting their kids watch TV for 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day. So I tell them, please give yourself a break. Just try to be a good enough parent. And a lot of us watched 3 and 4 hours of TV when we were kids, and we've turned out okay. And what Amanda Ripley says is that parents especially should focus on the notion of being a good enough parent. And what she means by that is just pick 1 or 2 things that you think are really important. In terms of schooling, she would say you can't keep your kids up to date in every subject. And as an American, she would recommend, help your kids with math. That's the hardest thing. That's the thing that gets most difficult quickly. So she would say, let's target a couple things that we can do. One other thing that may change how you're experiencing this pandemic is your basic personality. One trait that you all know about is extroversion, introversion. Some of us are outgoing, we like crowds, we like to be active. Others are more quiet and calm and slow-paced, maybe even shy. A very interesting thing has happened with introversion, extroversion, and that is usually the extroverts have an advantage. they usually feel happy, excited, and it's because they're very active and they're always with people, and that fosters positive emotions. But during this pandemic, the extroverts feel like they're kind of caged in. The introverts, by contrast, some of them are actually saying they they don't mind being at home and having more quiet existences. So here's someone who I don't even know who she is. I think she's some celebrity. Her name is Zoe Kravitz, and she had an Instagram post where she says, "Most people say I'm going crazy in a quarantine." And she says, "I'm living my best life. This is the way it should be." And you won't believe this, but I have at least 5 or 6 friends who are professors who say they've adapted pretty well because they're more of an introvert. I'm more of an introvert too, and in some ways it's been easier for me than it might be for you as an extrovert. Okay, what I'd like to talk about next is how to deal with the isolation, how to deal with the limited existence. I think David Saint Jacques, who's a Quebec hero, he's an astronaut, he's gone to space twice. He spent 216 days on the space shuttle. Uh, he's an engineer, astrophysicist, medical doctor, and he has honed his skills on dealing with anxiety, isolation, and uncertainty. And he had an interview with McGill University that was posted online, and he recommended 4 things, 4 simple rules that all of us can follow. I saw this interview at the end of March, and I actually followed his advice, and my life changed for the better. So the first thing he says is, we're in a bad situation, but he wasn't in such a great situation either up in space. It's very monotonous, it's very routine, he has to work hard, he's far from his family. But what he did is he tried to find meaning and purpose in the sacrifices he was making. And for him, he had always wanted to go to space. He had always wanted to be an astronaut, and he knew he was doing good work. So by focusing on the meaning and purpose of what he was doing, he was able to make the best of his time up in space. And he would say that we should think of what's happening to us now as being on a mission. We're on like mission pandemic, where we have to not only survive and take care of ourselves, but we have to help others to make sure they can get through this pandemic too. And he thinks that we should ennoble some of the things we're doing. So like when we put on a mask, when we maintain social distance, when we're very careful about not spreading any germs, we should take pride in the fact that we're protecting the safety of others and we're helping the civic cause. I grew up, my parents, they grew up in the Depression. They lived through World War II. And I always thought, oh my gosh, how could you survive that? Well, our grandchildren, when they hear about what we went through, they're going to say, how did you survive that? And we can make it meaningful and purposeful. And we can say we survived it well. The other thing he recommends, and I'm afraid some of us may need this advice. In space, it's unbelievably monotonous. It always seems the same. And he says you have to find a daily routine. And it's probably best to make it kind of a rigid routine so that there's predictability and so you can anticipate exactly the way the days will go. And we need that because there's so much uncertainty about our lives right now. Now, he does say that within this predictable routine, like you should go to sleep at the same time, wake up at the same time, you should make sure that there's some fulfilling things, some need satisfying things. So even though he's in space, he takes along a book, he takes along a chessboard, and he makes sure he does some fun things. He also makes sure that his night times are different from his daytime so that there's some difference. The other thing he recommends is that when your schedule is very monotonous, you have to really focus and try to breathe some life into your everyday activities. And he says you should create a mental bubble. So like if you make dinner every night, the tendency, I found what I was doing was I make pretty much I make like frankfurters or pasta every night. But what he says is no. In fact, what you should try to do is think about making a really nice meal and have a goal and see if you could improve the kind of meals you're making. So that when you're preparing the meal, it's not just like, oh, I'm going to slap it together and be done with it. See if you can focus and actually see if you could make it into a flow activity that's absorbing. The final thing, and I'm really embarrassed because I should have thought of this, but I didn't. And he says, up on the space station, there's a team of people, and he always makes sure that he's trying to help other people. He figures he can manage better than them, and he's looking to see if he can be helpful. And he recommends that we should do this during the pandemic. We should try to remember if there's someone in our life who might be quite alone right now. And so after I saw this talk, I got in touch with an older person who I used to know. And now I talk to him every week for about an hour, and I text him. And I think he appreciates it. But what surprised me is how much it means to me. And that's the secret. Psychology research actually shows that if when we help someone else, and if it's genuine, well motivated help, the positive effects are not only for the other person, but they redound onto us too. So helping others is a very good way to find purpose and meaning. Okay, I think okay. I have one last thing that I'll say. I'm a researcher and I love data and I love new findings. And just this week, I analyzed a 1-year longitudinal study with university students at McGill and Concordia. We always begin the study in September, and we ask people, what are your 3 biggest goals for this next school year? And then we measure their well-being, their personality, and their motivation. And we follow them in October, in December, in January, all the way until May. I've been doing this for 10 years, but this is the first time that in the middle of the study, a worldwide pandemic hit. And so what I can do is I can compare what happened to young people's goals, what happens to young people's well-being this year compared to previous years. I can also look at what helped certain people, who was able to be resilient. And what I found, this you'll expect, is that young people had a very hard time reaching their goals. We always have a hard time reaching our goals. One of the secrets of goals is that we fail way more often than we succeed. And we have to try many times. But this year, people really failed worse than usual. The second thing is well-being dropped off very badly. It always drops off in the first semester, but then it recovers in the second semester. This year, it never recovered. Instead, anxiety and depression went up. So for young people, even at a prestigious, world-renowned university like McGill, most of them are from well-off families, their well-being suffered. So now the next question is, so here are the key findings. Goal progress went down, psychological distress went up. Something we did, one of my graduate students thought of it, is we asked people in March, did you find a new goal because of the pandemic? Did you think of something that you thought might help you? For example, it might reduce your anxiety or might give you meaning. And what we found was about half of the people generated a new goal. Half did it. And I wanted to show you the goals, but I don't have time. But they were really pretty wonderful goals. Some of them were about self-improvement. Some of them were about helping others. Some of them were about learning new things, like learning new languages. But only half of us thought of that. So I did something very simple. I said, okay, I'm going to look at the half that set a new goal for the pandemic. I'm going to compare them with the half who didn't. And I want to see whether they got more depressed or less depressed from March until May. And amazingly, the ones who set a new goal showed a marked reduction in anxiety and distress, and they showed an improvement. So there is something special, I think, we can get from responding to this terrible situation by finding a personal goal that seems meaningful and interesting. Now, the final thing I'm going to tell you, and I include this because I think people in your community will fall into this category. We wanted to see who was it who set a new goal, a new goal that actually helped them cope. And all the way back in September, we had asked people, what are your life aspirations? What do you really care about? And we distinguish between people who focus on intrinsic aspirations, things like, I want to really grow as a person. I want to have good relationships. I want to be a part of a community. Those are the intrinsic aspirations. And then we had extrinsic aspirations. I want to be attractive. I want to be famous. I want to be popular. And all of us have both kinds of aspirations. But some people would say it's the balance. What we found is it's the people who really endorse the intrinsic aspirations about relationships, self-development, and community. They were the ones who found a new goal when the pandemic struck. And they were the ones who were able to ward off the, the worst effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And my sense is that your community does a really nice job of orienting people to these intrinsic values. So I'm hoping that many of you have set some new goals, but if you haven't, it's not too late. And please think about that. So this is just a quick review, how to achieve well-being during a pandemic. And thank you very much. I hope I didn't run over.